Welcome back. We're going to shift gears a little bit. We've been focusing on some pretty heavy-duty topics on morality, conscience, and how we form all of those attitudes in our life. I want to talk a little bit here about our own spirituality. I was walking through a bookstore not long ago, and I wandered into the section where they have all these self-help books. You probably know what I'm talking about. I was amazed at the number of titles and all the authors that have written on ways that help people understand themselves and come to an understanding of life, what the meaning of their existence is, and so on. And not to be critical on these things, because I think there's some very, very good books there, and some of these writers provide some great insights into living. But it did make me think that most of the answers that we're seeking for are usually in front of us in our own scriptures in the Bible. So I'm going to spend a little time just talking about that and shifting our thought a little bit into our faith in God and how that faith helps us to understand life. Interestingly, just this week, the Maclean's magazine came out. The title of the magazine was How Jesus, Saves. It did talk about some of the other religions too. Religion in general, that those people who have a faith, that have tried to live by that faith, tend to have less depression, more confidence in themselves, often do better in school, so on and so on and so on. It was a great article, kind of timely in terms of this topic today. The Bible really is a record of man's journey with God and the story of God's revelation of himself to us. If we focus on that a little bit, it does help to draw us into what right living is. God chose a people to reveal himself to. It could have been any people, really. But he chose the Jewish race. And he did this through his covenant with Abraham. Excuse me. And we should know the Exodus story very well. If not, I'll just kind of briefly summarize it. Jacob, who had 12 sons, go to Egypt along with all of their families because their land is experiencing a drought and a famine. And they know that Egypt has lots of food. And so they go there. And they're invited in, of course, and they stay there for some 400 years. And in that time period, they multiply and become a great nation. So great, in fact, that Pharaoh and the Egyptians are fearful of them. And so to protect themselves, they throw them into slavery and they make them work, build all these temples and pyramids and so on. And of course, God hears their cries. And God sends Moses to deliver them from this oppression. And we know also the great miracles that God performs in freeing his people. He sends plagues on Egypt. Eventually they are able to get out of Egypt. He parts the waters of the Red Sea so that they can escape Pharaoh's army. He feeds his people manna in the desert. He gets water from a rock because they're thirsty. They spend 40 years in the desert. All that time being led by God in this whole wilderness experience. Well, throughout those years, God was really forming and shaping his people. He gave them the commandments, the 10 commandments, and he put certain laws upon them, laws to live by. He made this covenant with his people. God made a few covenants. He made one with Abraham, but this one he made with Moses and the Israelites in the desert, he said this to them: I will be your God, and you will be my people. So it was a conditional covenant, kind of if you do this, I will do that. So in fact, God wanted faithfulness to his people. He wanted them to worship God alone. And if they did that, God promised he would always walk beside them, be with them, lead them into not only the promised land, but into eternal life. Well, unfortunately, about 600 after about 600 years of this covenant, the people finally, just rejected God outright. And as a result, in about 585 BC, the Babylonians moved in, they swooped down on Israel, they captured it, they took the people into exile, into slavery in Babylon, and basically people broke their covenant with God. It was truly unfortunate because that covenant with God was a very rich and beautiful covenant. It had brought the people into the promised land. It had given them bounty and beauty. It had given them all the good things in life. But once they started tasting those good things in life, their covenant with God began to fall apart. And they began to worship other gods, and they married outside their faith, and they became possessed with wealth. They ignored the poor, especially widows and orphans, and eventually they even ignored God himself. You might ask, what this has to do with a course on ethics and morality, what it has to do with, with God, this Old Testament story. Well, there is a message for us in the experience of the Israelite people. And as a people of this age, if we stacked ourselves up against the Israelites, what would be different? We've been given all the good things of life. We've been given wealth and prosperity. We've been given so much that, in fact, we've started to ignore God in our own lives. So what will happen with our covenant with God? The new and everlasting covenant given to us through Jesus Christ. Certainly, God isn't going to break that because he's already told us he wouldn't, that his covenant would be everlasting. But if we fail in our life to choose God, if we fail to choose God, what is going to happen? So that's the challenge of this next unit. Where does God fit into our life? What is it that we worship? How do we live out the call of our faith?